I certainly think there's some value in being an HR business partner because you become the business partner to the CEO. We're talking about this like cyclical nature of a business where leaders are mismanaging growth, and then the repercussions of that are people related.
We may have to right size the business to be able to make sure the numbers all work. In such an environment is when I feel like the freeze in the middle is the deepest. And at the same time, there's an even bigger need for psychological safety at the team level. Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for joining my podcast. I really appreciate it. Every time I've talked to you, I've been like, oh man, we should have recorded this stuff because we've had such great conversations. So we're finally doing it. I'm super excited to welcome you. And I would love for us to start off with maybe getting a quick introduction for yourself, and then I'll ask you some questions.
Yeah, sure. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I think I'll just do a quick intro. So I'm Mark Putrus. I'm the Chief People Officer at Nativo. I've been with Nativo now just a little over 2 years. Prior to that, I was the Chief People Officer for a ed tech company. And then prior to that, I was a head of HR for a business unit of a $1 billion market cap med tech company. And really, that was the company where I got my start in the people and culture space. And I actually entered through learning and development. And then prior to that, I held a number of commercial operations and commercial leadership roles. And I actually started my career in sales. So I have I always say I have a bleeding heart for the commercial organization and sales organizations because that's where I got my start.
I love it. So you have diverse experience across big company, small company, across commercial, and then obviously learning and development, and then people and culture. Um, it is so fantastic that you have such diversity of experience because I think the theme that we're seeing more and more is that people are looking for people leaders who understand the business and understand beyond the HR function. Not to say that we take anything away from the responsibilities in HR, but I think it's important to really have a nuanced understanding and full context of the business if they're going to be the right people partner for their companies. Any thoughts about that? I mean, I'd love to kind of get your thought process on it because you're kind of living it day to day.
Yeah, I guess, it's hard to say, right? Because I didn't grow up in sort of what I call traditional 1980s HR, right? So I'm not entirely sure, other than my own experiences when I was working with the HR business partners when I was a commercial leader. So here's my 2 cents on it. It's certainly anybody can come in and make an impact as a executive people leader in an organization. To me, it's not so much whether you started in HR or you didn't. You certainly need to speak the language of the business, but if you have a genuine curiosity, you don't necessarily just need to partner because you become a part of the business. It's actually one of those things. When I was with an organization some years ago, we used to refer to the business as the business. And I was like, well, why am I not a part of the business? Why do we refer to them as something separate? Like, I am just as important in this equation. So, anywho, I think it's just more the characteristic around having a genuine curiosity, partnering with people and asking questions about the business of which you might not understand. But that's doesn't matter whether you grew up in HR or you didn't. That's something we should be doing anyways as we onboard into an organization. So my 2 cents on this is I know there's some debate about it. I certainly know CEOs are looking for people who have diverse backgrounds that maybe haven't historically been in HR. I think it's short sighted. I think anyone can add value if they have those other characteristics I mentioned.
I I think you couldn't have said it better. And this is like a good reminder for me why I convinced you to come join the podcast, because I every time you say these things, I'm like, yes, that's the right framing. Um, I think that we're 100% aligned that it doesn't matter sort of what your professional upbringing has been like, but like really what matters is what you bring. If you have the curiosity, if you understand that you are the business, in addition to um, being open minded about learning, I think that's really what's needed here. Whether you grew up in HR or grew up outside HR, it doesn't matter. But as you were speaking, um, I've had this insight where I did interface with HR from time to time in my career before I had gotten into building an HR tech product. And as I started to go around discovery around it, I realized I had no idea what the HR people actually did. Like what they're like, for me, they were like they're approving holidays or they're helping me sort out kind of something that's going off the rails. But like, what do they do on a day-to-day basis? So curious to know, like, when you were on the commercial side of the business, was it the same experience for you, or you when you started to get into the function, you were like, oh, I had a very different view of what my colleagues did before I started to kind of sit next to them and see them? Or was it like you kind of had a good understanding of it because it was phased in?
For me, it was more of a phased approach, but I can appreciate where you're coming from. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why some of the larger organizations today are having people rotate through the people function, because you gain a real deep appreciation for talent and how talent navigates across the organization. You know, depending on depending on the size of the organization, the larger the organization, the more they have these centers of excellence and sort of subject matter experts that sit within the total rewards and benefits and so on and so on. But I think generally one of the most rewarding and insightful roles in an organization is the HR business partner. And to me, especially at the most senior levels of the organization, if you aspire to be a head of people, a chief people officer, I certainly think there's some value in being an HR business partner, because you become the business partner to the CEO. You become their confidant. You establish a relationship in which it is okay for you to say, no, I disagree, with no repercussion. And I think if that relationship exists, that doesn't just benefit the relationship between the head of people or chief people officer and the CEO. You know who benefits? The broader business. Every single person in that business, the clients who interface with that business benefit from that relationship, because you can, without sort of someone being your kind of right hand person and opening your eyes to things you don't see because you're moving so fast and furious, you're flying blind. And so I think it is certainly valuable to have that relationship. And so if you aspire to be in that most senior role, at some point in your career, stepping into a business partner role can be very
For aspiring chief people officers, the HR business partner is a great sort of academy for learning how to become a confidant to the CEO and truly creating value, not just for the relationship between the HR business partner and the CEO, but the broader stakeholder community as well. That's amazing. I want to talk about a few more things, and I want to keep us moving along because there's so many cool things to talk about. Um, Workplace operating systems. I know we've talked about that a few times previously. I guess, what is the workplace operating system? What about it is kind of is true and will stay true for the next kind of 50, 100 years? And what needs to change? So any thoughts there would be super helpful.
Yeah, so the workplace operating system I would describe is very much like the operating system on our computers. If you've got a PC, you've got a Microsoft operating system. If you're on a Mac, you've got the iOS or OS operating system, depending on what device we're talking about. And it's what allows us to be able to do all the different things that we do in our technology, right? For me, the workplace operating system is exactly the same. It's all the different systems, all the different applications, all the different interactions that we have within the organization. So when we start talking about sort of this refresh that's needed, the operating system that we deploy today, and the reason why I feel like there's some really good proof cases around this need to refresh is when the pandemic hit, we took a operating system that traditionally worked in an office and we deployed it right into this remote distributed type distributed type uh, operating model. And then all of a sudden, what happened is months in, people started going, "Oh wow, I'm so fatigued. I have Zoom fatigue." And then, I started reflecting on this, probably about, and I know the pandemic sort of went on, but like about 6, 7, 8 months in, I started thinking all we did was took what we were doing in the office where we had meeting fatigue and we just went and did the same thing remotely. And so when I talk about a new operating system, it's really how the organization behaves, how it interacts, how people interact, how collaboration happens. Is it frictionless or is there a lot of friction in terms of how we collaborate? Can we get a lot more work done asynchronously versus synchronously? When we do bring, if you're in a distributed workforce, when you do bring people together, is it being done with intention? So you can balance intentional sort of meetups and connection with flexibility. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm referring to a new operating system, a new model of working.
Oh man. Okay, yeah, you're right. I experienced that where one day we were in an office and the next day we were all on Zoom looking at each other like, what's going on? Um, and I think the refresh is important, and I think the intentional point is very clear. I think the thought in my mind though is like, where do you start? Like, it's a pretty broad swath of things. I guess if you had to kind of think about like where the refresh begins, how do you go about that? Where do you start?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you start tackling this bit by bit, right? So, one, do you have the right platforms in place to be able to do asynchronous work, right? You can say, hey, we need to get better at asynchronous collaboration, but many organizations and peers of mine or colleagues that I speak to, they don't even have the right collaboration platforms in place. So, just assessing whether you have the right tools. But it could be as simple as meetings, right? People say, oh, we have way too many meetings. Okay, well, how can you? It's not about the meeting. Meeting is part of work, right? People need to meet and they need to synchronously connect. But can you be more effective and efficient with those meetings? And so it could be just focusing on two or three areas. And that's what we've done at Nativo is we're not trying to boil the ocean, right? We try to operate with blue sky thinking, but at the end of the day, when we get down to brass tacks and decisions, we don't try to boil the ocean. We try to get in and get a couple of things that we know we want to improve on, and we sort of become relentless and obsessive about it. And to me, that's a good way to sort of put something in place. People walk away with understanding the why behind it, and you measure its effectiveness. If you try to do too much, it's hard to measure, and then you have so many variables, you don't know what change actually made an impact in terms of level of engagement or retention and all the different measures that you might use to see how effective, and also business performance, right? But all those ways of measuring, if you're not careful and you try to deploy too much, it's hard to really know what was effective.
It's hard to know what works if you try to do too much at the same time. Not being intentional is probably the single biggest mistake that companies can make. And as I think about that, I kind of feel like there's COVID put everybody into like a remote world, and as we got adjusted to it, we're now kind of starting to see various forms of return to work. So I guess let's talk about return to work, right? Like, what does that look like? I know that some companies are going all in on the remote side. Some companies are saying we need to have flex days where some people come back. Others are gradually like adding like 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 days a week in the office. I guess how do we think about that?
Yeah, let me start by saying something that's going to be somewhat provocative and maybe controversial. If we look at the noise, and I think it's a little bit of just media overplay, right? But if we see some of the stuff that's being published on this topic of return to work or office versus remote, on the office side, it's interesting that the big names that oftentimes, and I won't say them here, but the big names that often get featured, it's fascinating to me because we're all unique, but they all look the same. I've yet to actually hear from a woman CEO that's suggesting that we should all return to the office. So it's amazing how the demographics look very similar. And so when we start taking into consideration the diverse workforces in which we work in and the reality of the situation, we're actually debating the wrong thing, because it doesn't really matter whether the business is better designed to work in person or remote. It's really more about, are we setting up people for success in terms of when they can deliver their best work? And it probably is a blend. It probably is a blend. And there was a debate recently that I saw around providing people with, a lot of people have adopted these meeting free days where you get a flex Friday, or a meeting free Wednesday, or whatever the case. And I saw this debate going on reviews, and reviews take time, and some people do formal written reviews, and so we would. The debate was, should we offer up a day so that everybody can write their reviews in that day? And one of the immediate, I thought, oh, that's a really great idea, right? Because it immediately showcases from an organizational standpoint how important development and feedback is. And then the thought crossed my mind, but you're asking people in that day to write a review. And maybe that's not when they operate at their very best in terms of written feedback. Maybe they're best early in the morning or best late in the evening. And it doesn't necessarily take into consideration the diverse modes that people work in, or where they can operate at their very best. And so the thought crossed my mind, I wonder if that I wonder if that's actually going to work out for the organization that was contemplating moving that forward, only because people sometimes operate in terms of their peak performance at different hours of the day. I find that in those early mornings after I drop the kids off from school, I'm sometimes at my most productive. But I also find that I'm my most creative, not productive, but my most creative between 9 and 11. And so I might do more of my creative work between 9 and 11, and I may do more of my things that I need to get done where I'm most productive in the morning. Now, that works for me. That may not work for others. And so I don't know, maybe that day needs to be reimagined, and or maybe also people enjoy doing 2 hour sprints. So I'll write for 2 hours and I need to do another one. I'm going to write for 2 hours the next day or the next day, rather than 4 hours all at once, because that's better for them. So sometimes when we deploy these programs, or what we consider to be sort of perks around flexibility, I don't know if that flexibility is perceived by the person that we're offering it to the same way.
Mm. Yeah, I think the designers need to be on the floor and see how the product is being used is a very common kind of theme that goes around. And I think same thing with this, right? A day to do performance reviews is a great idea because it gives people the time and space to be able to be thoughtful about them. But that may not be their optimal time for writing. And actually, one other thing that this brought to my mind is, like, a lot of people don't even know what their productive, creative, and less productive zones are. So how do we, like, I mean, any tips here for, like, the people in the audience, like, how do you know that your mornings are more productive and your late mornings are more creative? How did you figure that out?
I think it's trial and error. Like I would suggest that people trial different ways of working, right? If you typically take a lot of meetings in the morning, you wouldn't know, if you were to block out your calendar for a couple of hours, how productive. So you may not even know. So you may need to trial and error, block your calendar, or ask people to help, depending on, whether you control your calendar as much as others. Like, give yourself some space to try different ways of working and tackling things. Quite frankly, to me, it just happened by accident, because I found myself sort of leaning towards those hours of where I get the space, and I've got kind of the opportunity to get into sort of deep think. And sometimes, like, I'm not very productive when it comes into the evening after the kids go down, but I am super creative. And I think it's because I'm replaying a lot of the conversations, and then the back of the brain, the part of the brain that is sort of unconsciously sort of working, it all of a sudden starts to fire and things start to come to me in terms of connections. But I know that won't be for everybody. Maybe for some people, it's on a run, right? In the early morning at 5 a.m. Some people get up super early, and on that run is when they're the most creative. And they find, wow, okay, I've come back from my run feeling really refreshed, but I also have two really great ideas. I've heard that a couple of
Yeah.
times from people.
I
So I think people sort of naturally gravitate towards, you know, ideas that come to them. Or I mean, people talk about the ideation that happens in the shower, right? And it's when you're not thinking deeply about something is when, and I think it's because maybe my brain is starting to get ready to shut off, and I'm not thinking as heavily in the evening. But I think, to each their own. Everyone's got their own.
Absolutely. I think the common theme there is like giving ourselves a time to be able to let the sort of back of the head thoughts bubble up, like whether it's on a run or, in the shower or later in the evening. I think that's when a lot of the best ideas come through. So having um, time and space for that will help create that work life harmony or whatever it is on the calendar, which lets people become more productive. Um,
Mhm.
Another kind of thing that I want to talk to you about is we've seen this. I think we live in very interesting times, right? Because we have seen the sort of rapid exponential growth of companies, and then we've seen like these jarring layoff sort of um, series of layoffs across the businesses. And for me, it is very hard to process that in the sense that if there's been a massive leadership change or something, like there was a person who was driving this way and a new person comes in, maybe there's some way to talk about that. But like by and large, the leadership, the board is the same. But you've seen this company grow like 4x 2 years ago and then downsize significantly. What's going on here? Like, I mean, am I missing something? Like if you were to explain this to somebody that's over a 5 year period, a company doubled its headcount and then went back to like 50%, they would have a very hard time believing it, right? But like it's happened. So how um how should we think about this? Because I feel like a lot of people have been impacted by it and I think they continue to get impacted by it. But nobody really has a view of what happens at these board and leadership levels. And you've had the experience of like big company, small company, and I'm not asking to talk about anything about your specific business, but broadly help us understand what's going on and I guess help us diagnose it a little bit better, maybe.
Yeah, I have a unique perspective on this, and I think one example we can use that's been in the media just as of the last. It started in August, but just as of this week was WeWork. I mean, at one point, WeWork, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was valued at like 47 billion, and yeah, and now they're filing Chapter 11. I think they would be an example of what you're talking about, where the board and the leadership has turned, right? So to some degree you could argue that that's an example of like a fundamental belief where management is held accountable. I guess where I have a bit of maybe again a provocative or controversial view, and to me, I think Simon Sinek talks about shareholder supremacy, and I guess that's where I'm going with this is, is the executive management and leadership held accountable? Layoffs are, there are going to be reasons why you need to do layoffs. And some of them are things you can't plan for. I mean, one perfect example is the pandemic. Who would have known, right? But we're talking about this like cyclical nature of a business where leaders are mismanaging growth. And then the repercussions of that are people related. And then we're laying people off. And I understand you can't then just retain people and then impact economic growth. That's also not going to work, right? You have to continue to facilitate good business practices. But what what worries me though is when I see what I call perverse practices, where leaders are growing a business absolutely knowing that at some point that runway will run out and they will lay people off. And then you get into this cycle of laying people off. And that has, to me, severe consequences for those people that you're laying off. And so I would just like to see more board engagement with the leadership to ensure there's some level of accountability around these business practices, so we don't get into this kind of, at all cost, and then those people get laid off. But the worst part about it is when I see mass layoffs like that, and then executive leadership, because I've seen it myself and I've experienced it myself. Executive leadership walks away with these huge bonuses because of the cost savings. Like, to me, that's just rewarding the wrong behaviors. And so that's what my worry is. And I got into a debate with somebody, I think on a LinkedIn post on this particular topic. And, you know, they were talking about just the cyclical nature and the need for layoffs. And I'm not suggesting by no means that layoffs shouldn't occur. I actually think that's also bad, right? In terms of economic growth. However, what I worry about is the lack of accountability and how we reward for those cost savings initiatives in that scenario where you lay off, let's just say, hundreds or thousands of people. To me, that is a time in which that executive leadership team gets zero bonus. And if that
100%.
saves a number of jobs, even better.
That is a very good point. And I think I was going to ask you, like, what's the way to fix it? And I think the way to fix it is that the bonuses or any such incentives, um, CEO should get paid last, right? If people are losing their jobs, their livelihoods, their whole world is being turned upside down. Um, the people that took the risk, whether it's the board or the, governance, team, leadership team, they should be last in line. I mean, we should have highly profitable businesses and they should generate profit and create value. But at the same time, you're right. I think that in more so in recent past with like zero interest rates and whatever, we kind of became quite reckless, right? Where, I understand if it's a high capital intensive, high risk project with like a real detailed um, scientific innovation component to it. But if you're building SaaS software or if you're building like, you know, something like that, it shouldn't be so jarring. And I feel like a lot of it also occurs because there's no good data around the table. So like the HR VP or the management team need to work with the CEO and say, hey, this is what you want to do, massive expansion into this region. This is the true cost of it, right? Not the sort of, we kind of took an Excel sheet and we put a number and then we just went like that, but more like, okay, this thing is going to cost truly 4 times more than you're thinking it's going to cost. So for us to recoup it, we're going to need to make a lot more money than the business model says. And if we can't be confident about doing that, perhaps we need to do some more work, do some more research, do some more homework before we can kind of go all in on this thing. Because the challenge then becomes like, we also don't want our leadership teams to become completely risk averse and say, look, this is our business and we're going to gradually just die away because the innovators are going to come in and they're going to continue to steal market share from us. So how how do we make sure that we don't, we let our businesses take risk that they understand? How do we make sure that it doesn't become imbalanced on either side?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with that one. This is going to sound really tactical, but when you get an opportunity to, sort of, I describe it as see how the sausage is made. You would you you would be really surprised at how many organizations, and not just organizations I've been a part of, but also organizations when I talk to my peers, how unsophisticated building some of these cost models are, right? And so a lot of guessing, not a lot of sophisticated workforce planning. Now, the larger the organization, where you've got a number of disciplines and you've got dedicated resources, I do think they do a little bit better job. Like the larger organizations have been a part of. But it's the smaller organizations that are the ones that we're talking about that sort of unravel. And I think, and I know you're not expecting an Agent Noon plug, but I will tell you that's the point of the platform,
Yeah.
is to have a much more sophisticated view on your workforce. And so you understand the real costs, not something that, what I call finance sort of, this seems about right. Like that's the whole point of using a platform like Agent Noon, to have a much better view on, when you do decide to scale, what those costs are, because I think they're grossly underestimated. And it's just because finance is under pressure to put these financial models together, and they're doing the best they can based on historical, and not really understanding that when 75, 80%, most organizations, probably not all, but most organizations, probably 75 to 80% of their P&L are human capital costs, right? So to me, I don't. I think it's sort of inexcusable that this doesn't become a priority. So, and workforce planning is much broader than just the financial aspects of this. But I think what we're talking about is, if you have a tool like this, especially if you're in a smaller team, and even a team of one, you'll be far more sophisticated, and you'll be able to guide your business leaders around these growth numbers with a, to me, as an HR practitioner, you'll rival your finance business partner, because you'll have a lot more detail on your talent and how your talent moves and comes into the organization than finance has, and they appreciate it. Our finance business partners certainly appreciate our level of interest and engagement in this area, because it also helps them build more accurate forecasts and models. So I think some of this has to do with our involvement around workforce planning. And again, I'm going in that direction only because I think that's one of the most underestimated areas of which HR practitioners can add
That is so amazing. That was very nicely put, and you hit on all the right points. I 100% agree with you. I think that finance absolutely welcomes more specificity and more accuracy around workforce plans. And when they don't get that, they sometimes have to take the extreme step of saying nothing goes through until finance approves it. And it
value.
creates a lot of, bureaucracy, and it creates a lot of red tape, and it creates a lot of like people catching the CEO by the water cooler and saying, "Hey, you know that thing that you really want to do? If only I had five more people, I would do it." Right?
Yeah.
It completely shortcuts the whole process. And now suddenly you have like people who are like, showing up on your hiring plans. They're putting pressure on your talent teams. They're putting pressure on all of your other stuff because you haven't had time to plan for them. So, in my experience as well, the more specific and accurate we can make workforce plans, the more love finance will have for it, and then overall, the more clarity the board and the leadership team will have around what the true cost of these things are. Um, Today, like according to my estimates, the error rate on a workforce plan is anywhere in the 30 to 40%,
Mm.
sometimes more, right? I'm being very sort of generous here. And what we've seen happen with just, some good old integrations into the right systems, right spreadsheets, some visual workforce plans, us doing the math, that error rate can go down to 1 to 2%. That 1 to 2% is what the finance people love, because that's kind of usually the error rate on their models when they have all the time in the world. So, this, I feel like this is becoming a commercial for Agent Noon, so we should maybe take a step back. But well, I started a company here because I'm so motivated about this space, and I think that it was a similar story where I was like, how are we making such big decisions around 70, 80% of our cost? How are we making these decisions in such a lackadaisical manner,
Mhm.
whereas we should be having a lot of rigor? And the answer was, there's no time, right? We have to do this thing. We have to make this decision. We have a day and a half to be able to make that decision. We've got to do the other 10 things. So, if we had 6 weeks or 2 months, we would go and do all the stuff that is being done. And I think that's where software can help a lot, right? But But at the same time, I think for a business to perform really well, they have to really build alignment between the HR function, the finance function, and what I call the decision making function, right? The CEO.
Mhm.
You've had a lot of experience. What are some tips for people looking at it from the HR side? How do you build rapport with your finance counterparts and your CEO so that everybody's kind of moving towards the same direction?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I forget the name of the book. It's Talent. I forget the name, but the McKinsey partners they wrote a book on I forget Talent Edge. It was some years ago. I remember reading it, and it was interesting because they talk about the G3 and the importance of the chief people officer or CHRO, the CFO, and the CEO, and that triad. So, and the importance of the alignment amongst them three, because you basically that is the brain trust, right? That is basically the three people who own every asset in the company. And so I mean, I feel very fortunate. The last two organizations that I've been a part of, I've had an incredible relationship with our CFO. They are absolutely, there was trust on both sides, uh, strong alignment on people and the cost associated with people. Uh, for the most part, CFOs, that haven't managed the people function, they maybe because in smaller organizations, I have seen where the HR function can report into the CFO. CFOs who haven't, they rely heavily on their executive counterpart to guide them because they haven't had a lot of personal experience outside of finance managing the people function. Those that have dipped into it have a deeper appreciation and probably even a stronger partnership with their head of people or CHRO or their chief people officer. But I think that relationship is critical, and having open lines of communication and frequent conversation. I mean, I have a standing one-on-one in our CFO today. We talk almost daily, and so it's very rare. Maybe a couple of days will go by at the most where we haven't connected via text or on the phone. I mean, it's a frequent conversation, and it because we're a part of that brain trust, right? And we're making not just financial decisions if you're a CFO or people decisions if you're in my role, but we're making business decisions. Because if you're really consulting with the CEO, then you're really you're driving sort of strong alignment around business decisions. And that's the difference, I think, is that you're not just in your swim lane. You've got sort of the business hat on, the executive enterprise executive hat on, and you're not just staying in your swim lane. And that to me is an expectation at the executive.
The expectation at the executive level is that you have the business hat on and you're not just in your swim lane. Um, I think that it may have been maybe a controversial opinion some years ago, but I think now, when the times that we are in, you're right. It is an expectation at the executive level. And I think that let's switch gears into a few other things, right? So you have talked about a bunch of things. And I mean, I kind of also want to talk to you about a few more things, right? The first thing is like what a role storytelling plays in our lives and what it does for organizations, for teams, for everyone. It's kind of been happening for a long time. If you could help us, our audience, become a little better at storytelling. You've told such phenomenal stories over the last kind of little bit. If you could teach us a little bit about storytelling, how to become a better storyteller, I guess, what would you say?
Yeah, it takes practice. So, I mean, I'd start with that. It does take practice, but you know what? To me, your stories. are what make you unique, right? So don't emulate other people, but you can watch other great storytellers. And to me, it's not so much about what you say, it's about how you make people feel. And so, I sort of point to, I think I've mentioned him before, but Simon Sinek, I mean, his I think TED Talk that went viral, several
Yeah,
years
I remember
ago
that. Yeah.
around, start with why. I mean, it's that's really probably the change in the trajectory of his career in terms of his contributions to society, because they have been vast, right? Because he's written a couple of great manuscripts. But I think it's about, we know stories and storytelling generally is what connects the human spirit. And so if you can think about the experiences and and come to the table with enormous amounts of compassion and empathy. And again, for me, that's something I feel like I shared with our executive team at our executive meeting several weeks ago. I had just expressed my sincere gratitude that I feel like I've been a part of this huge experiment at Nativo, and I feel so privileged to have been able to leverage the organization for my experimentation. But I'm a firm believer that compassion and performance are two things that normally are not said in the same sentence, but they can coexist in an organization. And so I feel like I've been on this path of bringing to life a high performing organization with an incredible amount of compassion and empathy. And so, and I feel like it's like my proof case or my case
Case
study
study.
that this
Yeah. Yeah.
can coexist, right? So my point is, the storytelling is what helps bridge gaps and make connection. And you'll talk about your own experiences, but you can also talk about other people's experiences and connect it back to the purpose and the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Like, why do you get up every morning? Why are you energized by it? And if people don't connect well with the purpose of why you exist, they're not going to operate with the same level of passion that you do. And so bringing people along on that journey and helping make those connections, because people won't always, especially more junior employees, they don't oftentimes make those connections. So leveraging storytelling to make those connections strengthens the fabric of the entire organization.
So basically, you just taught us a leadership masterclass, right? Like storytelling with purpose is really what motivates people to get up and do things, right? And the case study for you is your organization where you have built a high performing organization with a lot of compassion. So um, I think gone are the days of the tough guy, sort of like very industrial style um, company management. And I think this is the new way, right? Like the Simon Sinek's of the world. You have a real life case study. I think a lot of leaders today would rather figure out a way to develop intrinsic motivation in their team members to really achieve results, as opposed to sort of extrinsic motivation, whether it's stick or carrot, doesn't matter, but like really to get people to work on things because they want to, because they feel motivated to work on them. So let me ask a bridge question here. Like, as you've been doing that, have you seen any impacts on culture? Like, what has culture? What have you been surprised by? I guess when you look at your culture now, as you've built a high performance, high compassion business, um, yeah, what does culture look like?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the antithesis, I think, of the fear-based culture, right? I mean, I think we know there's good psychological literature. We know that fear is a really great short-term motivator, but it's certainly not healthy for an organization long-term, right? So, what I have seen by taking this approach, what I have seen is, and this is a bit overplayed, I think, but I think it's important, is there's a lot more psychological safety, not just psychological safety between leaders, but also within teams. And that is one thing we don't talk enough about, is the psychological safety that exists within teams. Because I think good leaders sort of operate at the fringe, right? And they know how to hover at 30,000 feet, but they know how to come down at 3 feet. And that blend and that sort of knowing when and how to do that is the magic, I think, of strong leadership. So if you're operating as a leader at the fringes, right? Sometimes you're at 3 feet, sometimes you're at 30,000 feet. Guess what? There's that thing in the middle, and it becomes paralyzed or frozen. And so, how do you unlock? You unlock it by ensuring that your culture embraces this concept of psychological safety. And if we can unfreeze, I just think I hear stories from my peers all the time. I'm like, oh, there's the frozen middle, there's the frozen center. I hear it all the time. And it's because, yes, some psychological safety does exist between the leader and their direct report. And that's an important relationship. But in a knowledge economy in which we are deploying a lot of critical thinking and a lot of collaboration amongst people, again, the frozen center, if you can unfreeze and unlock it through psychological safety at the team level, and I think there's a number of people who've been talking about this. Uh, yeah, I mean, this like team psychological safety, but not in the same context that I'm describing it in terms of unlocking the frozen center. They're just talking about the importance of it. I think that to me, that's sort of the like if you're trying to build a culture, and again, everybody's culture, there's not a one size fits all, right? Whatever works for your organization, you embrace, right? Whatever your values are, you live those values, and every company is a little bit different. And I love when I get to hear about these different types of values, and I'm like, oh, okay, that certainly is attractive. It wouldn't work here, but that's really attractive. That works for you. That's great. If that helps you, again, unlock that frozen middle.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I think your view of like the CEO is on the fringes and then there's this frozen middle is so true. I think for everyone who's listening, I think the next time they see that frozen middle, it'll just kind of become like abundantly clear to them.
Mhm.
Um, in in times of crisis, right? So for example, a lot of times leaders will come into businesses where their things aren't going well and it's a tough time and we're missing expectations or that's a different conversation altogether, but like the business is struggling. We may have to right size the business to be able to make sure the numbers all work. In such an environment is when I feel like the freeze in the middle is the deepest.
Mm.
And at the same time, there's an even bigger need for psychological safety at the team level. How do people kind of address that or balance, or how do people balance through that?
Yeah, I have an interesting framing on this, right? So, when a business is being right sized, and I think what you oftentimes will see is you'll see executive leadership sort of dive a little bit deeper in the organization. I have a slightly different frame on this, and we've even experienced that here to some degree at Nativo. I help people because I will talk to people who are on the, sort of what I call the ground floor, the front lines, and I'll talk to them and they'll be really intimidated by the fact that, somebody maybe more senior is getting more involved. And I help them understand that the reason why we do that is not to catch a direct report that maybe is managing that function or managing an area, not to catch them, but to better understand why things got missed. And it's called reconstructing accountability. There's a reason why that got missed. And sometimes we dive in, and that's that fringe where you go from 30,000 into 3 feet, because you might, in fact, from your experience, see something that somebody else missed. And what a great coaching opportunity and a great way to, again, unlock that frozen middle and grow your people. And so when you frame it like that to more junior people, they're like, oh my gosh, okay, whatever I can do to help. And they'll lean in. And then all of a sudden, reconstructing that accountability is so much easier. And you can deliver so much value so much faster. Because sometimes it is just a lack of experience and know how. And so all you're doing is solving the problem, right? Getting crystal clear around what the problem is, and then helping your leaders and reconstructing that accountability model. And guess what? You grow them, the business moves faster, and you start performing. And so I help people understand, if you look at it like that, all of a sudden it's better for them because they're now less frustrated on the front lines. And now you've grown a leader and they're feeling more capable. It's like this magic that happens in the
Yeah,
organization.
that is amazing. I think people often operate in fear. And when they don't have context, when they don't have clarity, they assume the worst case situation. Oh, my boss is here and they're looking at what I do. They're going to find out the one thing out of 100 that I may not have done as well as I should have. And now it's going to be cause for me to be, part of the team that's being shown the door. And I
Mm.
think that, to your point, leadership intertwined with culture, intertwined with storytelling, intertwined with coaching is such a phenomenal opportunity to provide clarity from the top, right? So as you are in an organization, you can basically say, look, this is what's not working. And now let's figure out a way to fix it and let's figure out a way to work together. And again, there's tons and tons of stories of how teams have rallied together in times of crisis when they've had context. And when they have no
Mm.
idea what's going on, it's just like people in the upstairs kind of make some decisions and then we just kind of get, you know, told what those are. So I think 100% right. It's such a phenomenal coaching opportunity. And I think it's usually in times of crisis that people can learn a lot more. And it's up to the leadership team to really make that happen. So thank you
Yeah.
for summarizing that. It's amazing. Um, We've had a great conversation. We've talked about Agent a little bit more than I would have liked, but I really enjoyed it. I think we've talked about Simon Sinek and we talked about the Start with Why. Are there any staple books or media that you send people to? Is there a favorite book or two or five that you will send to people or send to them, whether it's new joiners or whether it's young people? Yeah, please share that with us.
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of Simon Sinek. I think it's interesting. When he was very early on, he tells a story, and I'm not going to do it justice, but he tells this story about when he was in the early days of sort of introducing this concept of a new way of leading. And he tells the story. He was on stage, and a gentleman, stood up and asked him, Simon, have you? You're introducing all these things, right? And you could tell he was certainly a pessimist about it. And he said, "Have you ever managed a team of X? And have you ever found yourself leading an organization of X?" And he just said, "No." And here this guy feels like very proud that he challenged Simon Sinek. And basically, Simon said, "I'm not going to pick a fight with this guy." And he said, "Hey, if you don't like these ideas, I encourage you not to deploy them, and speak to the 99% of the people in that room that were looking for a new way of working, a new way of leading, right?" And that's been my philosophy. We're not going to win everybody over, but the people who really adopt this new way of working, the people in our purview, the people we are responsible for, they will benefit from it. And so I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek. I'm a huge fan of Keith Ferrazzi. So I would highly recommend anybody who's really trying to accelerate their leadership capability, especially any of Simon Sinek or Keith Ferrazzi. And it's Keith actually who I was going to mention earlier, who's been doing a lot of work around team psychological safety. And you'll see a lot of his recent research and the work he does at, I think it's Greenlight. But I mean, those are two people that come right to mind. There's a lot of new manuscripts around remote work that I'd highly encourage people, and I'm happy to share a couple of resources with you after the podcast that you can absolutely post. But there's a couple of new manuscripts that I've just got my hands on that I haven't read, but I've heard really good things about in terms of approaching remote work more like a product,
Hmm.
and understanding sort of the design thinking around it. And then a couple of other sort of asynchronous first opportunities, and how do you really construct that in an organization that has historically not worked in that way, and what are some of the landmines. And so I think some of these newer manuscripts can be good for any organization that is approaching things in a more virtual first, remote first fashion.
Thank you. I really appreciate this. I kind of want to let you go, but I also want to ask you another question. So I'm going to ask you one last question, I promise, and then we'll try to call it done. Um, you have phenomenal foresight about how to do things right when it comes to the relationships of the G3, how to have coaching and leadership and culture and all these things putting together. If you could kind of imagine with me for a second and say there's a top 1% chief people officer in 3 years from now, what do they look like in 3 years? Like, what do they do? What are their defining characteristics? You know, help me understand that, and I think that we'll try to wrap it up.
Yeah. So I think there's going to, certainly in the next decade, I think you're going to see a lot more chief people officers being CEOs. And I think you're going to see a lot more chief people officers sitting on boards. There's a healthy amount of them now, but I think you're going to see more because I think in this knowledge economy, people are especially especially boards, they're going to recognize in order to do their job as being fiduciary kind of responsibility or people who are fiduciary responsibility for who have fiduciary responsibility for shareholders, they're going to realize how more so today than ever how much talent plays a role. And I do think you're going to see a lot more representation on boards and a lot more CPOs who become CEOs. That is for sure in the next decade. I think the people who will end up in CPO roles over time are going to be those people who are sort of operating with this sort of mindset of being students of the business, genuinely curious, incredible listeners, compassionate, and blending that compassion and empathy with performance, and not afraid to take risks and experiment. Business leaders generally are far more likely to experiment and take risks than people leaders for some reason. And I think we have to have the same level of courage and safety within the organization to experiment. Because if we're saying that talent is so critical and we're under investing in experimentation,
Yeah,
then something is disconnected,
it's a
right? So
paradox. It's a
yeah,
paradox. hundred
yeah. So
percent.
I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next, even in the next 3 to 5 years.
I love it. I think you've spelled out the blueprint for success. To increase agency, people need to take risks. To take risks, they must be able to understand those risks. To be able to understand those risks, they have to be able to not look at themselves as a, you know, outside the business. They are the business, right? 70% of the
Right.
business is them. So I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up this conversation. Mark, I thank you so much. I could have probably asked you questions for another 2 hours. And you know what? I will probably invite you back so that we can continue this amazing conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.
Bye.